I'm going to show you how to adjust and replace the cutting system on the new Young Pumpin commercial grade grinder pumps. The first thing you want to do is take a 7/1000 feeler gauge to see if the cutting system is worn. Take the feeler gauge and slide it underneath the cutter blade and between the cutter plate. If it slides through like it does on this one, that means the cutter needs to be adjusted closer to the cutter plate for optimal performance. The first thing you want to do is remove the cutter blade. Just put an Allen wrench into the center, and we're going to use a piece of wood just to stop the cutter blade from turning. Remove the bolt. There's also a washer that's on there that remove as well, and then pull the cutter blade off. You'll notice underneath the cutter blade that there are shims. The shims can be removed to adjust for the height between the cutter plate and the cutter blade. In this instance, we're going to leave the shim off so that our cutter blade gets closer to the cutter plate. At this point, you also want to check the cutter blade to see if there's any nicks on the surface, and also check your cutter plate to see if there's any nicks on that as well. If you need to replace your cutter plate, these 4 bolts around the cutter plate need to be removed. Once you have all the screws removed around the cutter plate, pull it off. If you need to, you can use the Allen wrench to help pry the cutter plate off. Now this can be replaced if there's any damage on the surface. When you reinstall it, there are little dimples around the cutter plate that need to be lined up with the bolts. When you go to put it back on, make sure you line those up. Reinstall the 4 screws, making sure you have the washers under each one. Now that you've reinstalled your cutter plate, time to put the cutter blade back on. You want to make sure you have the shims in place. We're going to leave one of the shims off to adjust it down to the 7/1000. Notice when you're putting the shims on and the cutter blade that there is a key. Also put in the washer and then the bolt. Tighten the bolt down. Again, you can use a piece of wood to brace the cutter blade and tighten it down all the way. At this point, you want to check to make sure the adjustment that you made on your cutter blade is correct. Again, take your 7/1000 feeler gauge and make sure that it does not pass between your cutter blade and your cutter plate. Also make sure that the cutter blade moves freely. If you still have a gap that's larger than 7/1000, repeat the process and remove another shim. And that's how you adjust the cutting system.